I think we see that in Genesis chapter 37 and Genesis chapter 38. That's where we find ourselves this morning as we've been going systematically through the book of Genesis, and we are looking at the life of Jacob and then now Joseph. Now Jacob had finally settled in the land that God had promised to Abraham and to Isaac. He had 12 boys who became the 12 tribes of Israel. Now remember, Jacob's name was changed to Israel. Jacob the conniver, Israel governed by God. And you have this big contrast between a man who's been changed by God. And and one of the things you notice about Jacob is that, he kind of reverted back to his old nature on several occasions. And he's referred to as Jacob on those occasions. And then we see him being referred to as Israel, a man that had been changed by God and God's grace upon his life. And God is working behind the scenes. Think about what's happened. 20 years Jacob had left and went to Haran. And while he was in Haran, he acquires 2 wives, and then he gets their maidservants, and they become his wives, and that's where the 12 children come from. And he makes his journey back into the promised land. And he didn't go directly to Bethel. He lingers. He goes to Shechem. He spends about 10 years kind of wandering before he ever gets back to Bethel, the house of God, where he was supposed to be. 30 years of his life just, wasted from man's perspective. But God this whole time is preparing him for God's plan and God's purpose. At this point, there may have been 70 in the tribe. You count the 12 boys and then, their maidservants and Jacob and, just kind of all the whole clan, the other men that would have been in the clan. Maybe 70, not even close to a nation yet. Remember, God said he was going to make them a great nation. As many as the sand of the sea and the stars in the sky. There's not even a city yet. Not even a village. And so God is now preparing something to happen. And that's what you and I get to look at here in chapter 37 and chapter 38. God's plan for the future of the nation. Now remember back in Genesis chapter 15, just so you understand and I understand that this wasn't a coincidence or a chance, that God had already foretold to Abraham, close to 100 years earlier, if not more, what his plan was. Notice in Genesis chapter 15, if you can flip back with me just a couple chapters, Genesis chapter 15, look at verse 13 with me. God is speaking to Abram at the time before his name was changed to Abraham, and he says to Abram, "Know certainly that your descendants will be strangers in the land that is not theirs, and will serve them, and they will afflict them for 400 years. And also the nations whom they serve I will judge. And afterwards they shall come out with great possessions. Now as for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried at a good old age. But in the 4th generation they shall return here, for the iniquity of the Ammonites is not yet complete." Guys, this is fascinating because God is telling Abraham prophecy that the children of Israel, and we know now, would be going into Egypt, and they would be there for 400 years, and then afterwards they would leave Egypt, and they would bring all of the gold and silver out of Egypt, and God would bring them back into the promised land. So how is God going to accomplish that? What's the deal here? You're looking at, and we're going to look at the life of Joseph, who gets sold into slavery and he gets taken to Egypt. Guys, this is all the hand of God. In very natural circumstances and even in man's failure. I entitled the message, God's Sovereignty and Man's Subjugation. Guys, God's going to take them to Egypt for a very specific purpose. This is what we know about the Egyptians. The Egyptians were very snooty people. They would never mingle with Israelites. Israelites were sheep herders. They were shepherds. And they were looked down upon by the Egyptians. And so there would never be an intermingling of marriage. The women would never want a shepherd as a husband. The wives would not want, the men wouldn't want a shepherdess family as their wife. And so God sent them to a very safe place in that they wouldn't intermingle with the Egyptian people or the people of the land, because God was setting apart for himself a special people for his own purposes and for his own glory. And as we get to chapter 38, you'll see that that wasn't true in Canaan. We're going to look at Judah for a moment in chapter 38. And Judah ends up marrying a Canaanite wife. And we start to see that if they would have stood in that land, that they would have just intermingled with all of these false gods and been totally mixed in with all of the idolatry that was taking place. God's sovereignty. It's an incredible picture. Notice with me in chapter 37, we get a little bit of the background, and we get the story of how Joseph ends up in Egypt. Notice what happens. Now Jacob, verse 1, dwelt in the land where his father was a stranger, in the land of Canaan. This is the history of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was feeding the flock with his brothers. And the lad was with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and Joseph brought a bad report of them to his father. Joseph, 17 years old at this point. He's just a young boy. And he's out doing the work of a shepherd himself. He's there with his brothers, and his brothers were doing something underhanded. They were doing something that was affecting the family business. And Joseph comes back and he tells on them. Now like Joseph's a rat. What a snitch. And think about little brother going and telling on big brother. I mean, if you have little brothers, you know exactly how that happens, right? I can't believe, Dad, look what they're doing, right? But whatever's happening, you can look down on Joseph for this, but Joseph was concerned about his dad's inheritance and his dad's possessions, and it was their livelihood. And so Joseph now is going to dad, telling on him, and the brothers become very upset with Joseph. Notice the next verse. There in chapter 37, it tells us that Israel loved Joseph more than all his children because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a tunic of many colors. Joseph is the favorite. Now this is what we know about Joseph. Benjamin would have been just a toddler at the most at this point. We know that Joseph would have been the eldest of Rachel. And what's interesting is that Rachel was Jacob's favorite wife. It was the one he loved from the very beginning. He got duped into marrying Leah, and then he was given the other two gals because they wanted more children, and they're competing with one another for children. But Rachel was the love of his life, and Rachel dies, and Joseph was the firstborn of that family. And it tells us that Jacob loved Joseph more than the other brothers. Now, it's never good in a family when you have a favoritism for one son or for one daughter over the rest of the family, because the rest of the family becomes bitter toward that son or daughter. They become bitter toward mom and dad because they favored the one. And it's never a good idea, parents, to have that inside your home where you got one kid where you kind of favor them. Oh, you'll never become a nothing. We should be like so and so. And that's just a way to destroy a family. It's a way to destroy brothers and sisters, really. You just kind of start pitting them against one another. My wife is always kind of, with our kids, she's always told them, you're my favorite. But she tells that to every one of them. And so they all walk around thinking, I'm the favorite, I'm mom's favorite, I'm mom's favorite. But it was, and the kids knew that every time they were alone with mom that they were the favorite. And then the next one would go, hey, wait, I'm mom's favorite. No, I'm mom's favorite. She told me. No, she told me. And they just kind of banter with one another. But it's, the kids should be, loved just as much as the other ones. That God's made them all unique. God's made them all distinct. You can look at their different characteristics and different gifts and different talents that God has given each one of them. And as a parent, you want to acknowledge that they're all special in the eyes of God, and not one of them's more, favored than the other. And it's interesting that was passed down from Esau and Jacob. Remember Esau was dad's favorite, and Jacob was mom's favorite. And it seemed to be kind of the family culture here. They're picking their favorite, and Joseph's it. And then it tells us in there that Joseph had a coat of many colors, and it distinguished him from the rest of the kids. Guys, one of the things that kind of commentators talk about this is that it's really not talking about colors. It's talking about the length of the robe, and the length of the robe would mean that you were the heir to dad's treasures, dad's possessions. And so really what was happening is that Joseph, although he's the youngest, besides his little brother Benjamin, he's the one who's favored and given the promise that he was going to be the next in line. And what's incredible about this whole picture is that the brothers became very resentful of him. You're going to give him everything? Really? And you're going to leave us with nothing? Really? And he's the little guy, the 17-year-old. The rest of them are grown men by this point. And what's incredible is that this hatred continued to grow. Watch what it tells us in verse 4. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him, and they could not speak peaceably to him. Every time Joseph would show up, every time they would, Joseph's name would be mentioned, oh, hate that guy. Little sissy. Snitches on us. Daddy's little favorite. Right? anytime they saw Joseph, they just winched and closed their fist. That's how much they hated Joseph. And it didn't help the matter that Joseph begins to have dreams. That God was speaking to Joseph. It tells us, and it's interesting, we'll see Joseph interpreting dreams later on as he goes into Egypt. But watch what it says there in verse 6. Verse 5. Now Joseph had a dream, and he told it to his brothers, and they hated him even more. And they said to him, please hear this dream which I have dreamed. There we were binding sheaves in the field. Then behold, my sheaf arose also and stood upright, and indeed your sheaf stood all around and bowed down to my sheaf. And his brothers said to him, shall you indeed reign over us, or shall you indeed have dominion over us? So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. Now sheaves is what they would gather together, and it was their substance for food. And what's interesting is that when Joseph goes into Egypt, the sheaves, the grain is what he's going to store in order to save the world. And here Joseph goes, let me tell you, I had a dream. It was a crazy dream. I was just dreaming. We were gathering sheaves, and my sheaf was standing upright, and then your sheaves just started to bow down to me. It's just incredible. Can you imagine? Who do you think you are? Joseph. And it says when he started having these dreams, they started to despise him even more than they had already despised him. Now, you would think of this, and I'm convinced Joseph is just clueless. He's 17 years old. Now, a 17-year-old in our day is more like a 24-year-old. You know what I'm saying? You look he's 17 going on 29, right? We in that day, there wasn't TV and internet. There wasn't all of the exposure. They're living on a village. They're kind of away from everybody. And Joseph's 17 years old, and he's still a young man. Mentally, emotionally. And he's clueless. And he telling his brother the first dream, and then he tells the brothers the second dream. Look at this. Look at verse 9. And he dreamed still another dream, and told it to his brothers, and said, look, I have dreamed another dream. And this time, the sun and the moon and the 11 stars bow down to me. And he told it to his father and his brothers, and his father rebuked him and said to him, what is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall your mother and I and your brothers indeed bow down? to the earth before you, and his brothers envied him, and his father kept the matter in mind. Now, guys, I believe both those dreams had great significance. One of the dreams was on an earthly level, that Joseph was going to be elevated. But the stars and the moon and the sun, remember what God promised Abraham? That he would multiply the descendants of Abraham like the stars of the sky. This was a supernatural. This was a heavenly goal that God was going to accomplish. Not just an earthly one, not just the food, but God was going to elevate him, and God was going to use Joseph in a mighty way, and Joseph was going to need to know that. For 13 years, he's going to be in a trial. For 13 years, he's going to be sold into slavery. He's going to be thrown into prison. He's going to be treated wrongfully. He's going to be accused falsely. Right? Joseph's going to go through a 13-year trial. And when you're in the middle of a trial, God always gives you something to hold on to. And I believe this is what God's doing here. He's giving Joseph something to hold on to. When you were 17 years old, remember, I spoke to you that I was going to use you not only for earthly purposes, but for heavenly purposes. And Joseph, from that point on, man, would hold on to that. It's interesting in the scriptures, there's two men, and I said there was one guy at first service. I was reminded there's two guys in the Bible that the Bible never talks about their failure or their sin. One of them is Joseph, the other one Daniel. Joseph never is brought into a bad light in Scripture. And he becomes a type of Christ, and we'll see that in a moment in the Bible. As he's going to become a deliverer for his own family, but not only for his own family, but for the world. And what's incredible is at this point, Joseph is, having these dreams. His brothers, and this is what it says, they envied him. When you envy somebody, it means that you're jealous of them, right? I envy what they have. And he had a relationship with God. And God is speaking to him. And his father took the matter into his mind. He kept the matter in his mind. And think about, this is Jacob, Israel, whose name got changed to Israel, who wrestled with God, who had dreams. Remember, he was there, and there was a ladder going up into heaven, angels descending and ascending upon that ladder, and he saw God at the end of that ladder. So he knew what it was like to have dreams and visions. And he's pondering, man, God's speaking to my son. And God's got a plan for Joseph's life. And so this whole time, even though he rebukes him, he also stood back and go, man, I wonder what this really means. I wonder what God's doing behind the scenes. I wonder how God is going to preserve and what God's going to accomplish through Joseph's life. And as you're looking at this whole incident, man, you see that Joseph was a faithful young man. Faithful. Notice the next verse. There in verse 12, it tells us how the events unfold. Watch what it says. His brothers went to feed their father's flock in Shechem. Now, you remember where Shechem was? Shechem is the place where Dinah was raped. And not only was she raped there, but Simeon and Levi tell the men of Shechem, if they circumcise all the males, that they would let their daughters intermarry with them, and they would take their daughters and marry them. And then as they all circumcised, they were there recovering 3 days later, all still down, wounded, that they go in and they slaughter every last male. So Shechem would have been a dangerous region for the children of Israel to be hanging out in. There was definitely the Canaanites who were aware of what had happened, and they're there in Shechem feeding their flocks. And so notice what happens. Israel, and his name Israel, remember Jacob and Israel kind of interchanges. Israel said to Joseph, are not your brothers feeding the flocks in Shechem? Come, I will send you to them. And he said to him, here I am. And he said to him, please go and see if it is well with your brothers and well with the flocks, and bring back word to me. So he sent him out of the valley of Hebron, and he went to Shechem. Joseph going to check on his brothers because dad's worried that they've been gone so long. And I love Joseph. Here I am. Dad, what do you need? I'm here to do whatever you've asked me to do. I'll go check on my brothers if that's what you need me to do. And he willfully, goes at his dad's command, and he's just, 17-year-old and obedient. How abnormal is that? Right? 17-year-old, they go, Dad, what do you want me to do? I'll go do it. And then it tells us, as he's there going to Shechem, verse 15, a certain man found him. And there he was, wandering in the field. And the man asked him, saying, what are you seeking? And he said, I'm seeking my brothers. Please tell me where they are feeding their flocks. And the man said, they've departed from here, for I heard them say, let us go to Dothan. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them in Dothan. Now guys, how crazy is this? He's walking in a field. That means he's away from, city life. He's away from the crowds, and he's just kind of walking in the field, and here comes a man. Doop, 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 doop. And this man finds him, and he goes, hey, what are you doing here? He goes, oh, I'm just looking for my brothers. Oh, your brothers, I know where they're at. They went that way. What? I heard them talking, and guys, I'm convinced this is divine intervention. Whether it was a man or an angel, I don't know, but I believe God had sent him there because God had a plan for Joseph's life. And he sent him there so that he would find his brothers and that they would be separated from all civilization so that the plan that they were going to plot would be accomplished. And it's incredible because you see within this whole thing God's sovereignty. That God is planning something in a very natural way. He's planning to get Joseph to Egypt, and he's going to give him a free ticket. He's going to get a free ride on a camel all the way to Egypt because God had to get the children of Israel to Egypt. And guys, let me tell you something, man. God is big enough to get you where he wants you to be in a very natural way. And it might even seem like, God, why are you allowing this to happen? Why would I have to go through this? And Joseph, I'm sure at some point along the way, is asking the same questions. Notice he finds his brothers. They're in Dothan. This guy just out of the blue tells them, I just happened to hear them talking. I know where they're at. Go over there. 15-mile journey. They walk. He sees them coming. Look what it says. Look at verse 18. And when they saw Joseph afar off, even before he came near them, they conspired against him to kill him. Now remember, Joseph had the shiny little coat, the long robe, the colored, multicolored, whatever the distinction was. There was a distinction there. And they go, there comes Rainbow Boy. Right? We see him afar off. You can't miss that guy. Let's kill him. Let's just get rid of him. And then we'll see how great he is now. Daddy's little favorite, all the inheritance, all the dreams that Joseph has. We'll take care of this in 1 minute, man. We'll just kill Joseph right now. Their plan. Notice as he continues, watch what it was. And they said to one another, look, this dreamer's coming. Come, therefore, let us now kill him and cast him into some pit. And we shall say, some wild beast has devoured him. He shall see what will become of his dreams. But Reuben heard it, and he delivered him out of their hands. And he said to them, let us not kill him. And Reuben said to them, shed no blood, but cast him into the pit which is in the wilderness. And do not lay a hand on him, and Reuben might deliver him out of their brother's hand and bring him back to his father. Now Reuben is going, man, these guys are serious. They want to kill Joseph. And Reuben, being the eldest brother, feels responsible for his little brother. And so he's trying to compromise with his other brothers. It's interesting that his attempt to compromise wasn't a good idea, because we'll see that in a moment they'll come up with a different plan. You see, Reuben at some point could have stood up and said, guys, what are you thinking? Remember Cain? Remember Abel? Remember that Abel's blood cried out? And God was aware. He didn't just bring them truth. He tried to kind of, you know what, let's not kill him. Let's just throw him in a pit. And that compromise, just thinking that he was going to connive his way through, sneak him out at night, take him back to Dad and say, Dad, don't ever let Joseph alone again with the brothers. And that's what he was plotting. That's what he was planning. Rather than standing up for righteousness, standing up for truth, he thinks that he's going to, kind of appease them rather than stand up, and then watch what happens. And Reuben said to them, shed no blood. Verse 23, and says, so it came to pass when Joseph had come to his brothers, they stripped Joseph of his tunic, the tunic of many colors that was on him. And they took him and they cast him into a pit, and the pit was empty and there was no water in it. It would have been a cistern. They would dig these cisterns and plaster them so that when the rain would come, they would catch the rain, and then in the dry season they would be able to feed their flocks. And so it's interesting that these cisterns were empty at this point. The grass, obviously green in that region already, and they just take Joseph and they toss him into this little pit. And their intention was, we'll just let him die there. No, notice this. They took him, they cast him into a pit, and the pit was empty, and there was no water in it, and they sat down to eat a meal. And we can guess what they were eating. They were having Reuben sandwiches. No. They sat down to eat a meal. That was bad. Okay. Then they lifted their eyes and looked, and there was a company of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead, with their camels bearing spices, balm, and myrrh on their way to carrying them down to Egypt. So Judah said to his brothers, what profit is there if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come and let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hands be upon him, for he is our brother and our flesh. And his brothers listened. And the Midianite traders passed by. So the brothers pulled Joseph up, lifted him out of the pit, sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver, and they took Joseph to Egypt. 20 shekels of silver. Guys, does that sound familiar? Jesus sold the innocent one. And what's amazing about this whole picture is that they're sitting there as these Ishmaelites. Now, those have been descendants of Abraham through Hagar. And these guys are making a journey into Egypt to go sell their wares, to sell their goods. And the Judah, which would have been the fourth oldest brother, decides, you know what, I got a great idea. Let's just sell him, and rather than just killing him, at least we'll get a couple bucks. And they're making a bargain. I'm sure it started at 50 shekels, and then, then 50 pieces, and then, no, that's too much. Look at that guy. He's all beat up. Well, he wasn't beat up. He'll recover. We just beat him up. He's worth at least 30. No, I'll give you 20. Okay, 20. You got it. 20. And they get 2 pieces of silver each. There'd been 10 brothers. 2 pieces of silver each. And they sell Joseph. And he's on his way now to Egypt. Reuben wasn't even aware of what's going on. Reuben had disappeared somewhere. And it tells us that Reuben returned to the pit. And indeed, Joseph was not in the pit, so he tore his clothes. That was a sign of mourning, like, oh no. And he returned to his brothers and said, the lad is no more, and where shall I go? And how am I going to tell Dad? That's his favorite. What am I going to do? And it tells us, they took Joseph's tunic, they killed a kid of the goats, and they dipped the tunic in the blood, and they sent the tunic of many colors, and they brought it to their father and said, we have found this. Do you know whether this is your son's tunic or not? And he recognized it, and he said, it is my son's tunic. A wild beast has devoured him. Without doubt, Joseph is torn in pieces. And Jacob tore his clothes and put sackcloth on his waist. He mourned for his son for many days. And all of his sons and all of his daughters arose to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. He said, for I shall go down to the grave to my son in mourning. Thus his father wept for him. The Midianites had sold him to Egypt, to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard. Can you imagine? Now these 10 boys are, for the rest of their life, just, reminded of what they had done to their brother. Dad, just shaken to the core. Dad's going, you mean, how do I go on? Till the day I die, I will be mourning for my son Joseph. And it's a picture as you look at this whole thing, man, they plotted this whole thing out. They took a little goat, they slaughtered the goat, and they took the blood. And now you couldn't get away with that today because forensics, they would know that it was an animal, right? Animal blood, but then they can get away with it. They just, hey, that had to be, is this his coat? I'm not sure, Dad. I just found this on the way back. Yeah, right. And they lie to their dad. Every night they go to bed knowing the truth of what happened to Joseph, and yet no one's saying anything to Dad. For 13 years. For 13 years, man, they would have to live with this on their conscience. And for 13 years, man, every morning, every night, Dad waking up with a frown on his face, mourning for his son. And yet these guys, and tried to play it off. We know that it wasn't just sons, but he also had many daughters, and those daughters would come to try to comfort him, and he said, no, you know what, I will grieve until the day I die. That was Israel's response. I'm going to grieve till the day I die. And then we know that Joseph makes it safe to Potiphar's house. We'll pick up in chapter 39, Joseph in Egypt at Potiphar's house. Incredible. I can't wait for chapter 39. Okay, we'll get there. But all of a sudden, in this chapter, all of a sudden, we're given a detour. It's kind of like back at the ranch kind of thing. Because everything else is going to be Joseph's story. But we got this, just like this time out going, let's go back and visit what's going on with the children of Israel. And we're going to very specifically look at a man by the name of Judah. Now, if you remember the children of Israel's lineage, it was Reuben was the oldest. And then it was Simeon, Levi, and then Judah. Now, think about what's going on here, guys. Remember, Reuben slept with his dad's wife. So he's been eliminated from the family line, from the inheritance. Simeon and Levi are the ones who slaughtered the men in Shechem, and they're eliminated. And now we got Judah. So Judah now becomes the next in line as far as an heir goes and as far as the lineage of Christ goes. And it's incredible because one of the things you're going to notice as we're going through this chapter is that we're going to see firsthand the grace of God as we look at the life of Judah. Now notice what happens in chapter 38. It says, it came to pass at that time that Judah departed from his brothers, and he visited a certain Adullamite whose name was Hurrah. And Judah saw there a daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua, and he married her, and he went into her. So immediately, the story turns from Joseph being sent off to Egypt, and now we got Judah, the next in line, and it didn't take him long before he's now intermingling with the Canaanites. And God wasn't prejudiced against the Canaanites, but the problem is that the Canaanites were idolaters. And so what's going to happen now is that, the lineage continues to marry into idolatry. Then what happens is that the whole line becomes idolaters. And it didn't take long for Judah. He goes to visit a friend. He makes his way over there. He finds a woman there. He falls in love with her. And then it tells us after he marries her, he lies with her. And look at verse 3. She conceived and bore a son and called his name She conceived again and bore a son, and she called his name Onan. And she conceived yet again and bore a son and called his name Shelah. And he was at Shezib when she bore him. And then Judah took a wife for his firstborn. And her name was Tamar. So now the has grown up enough that he's now old enough to marry. And he finds another Canaanite woman, Tamar. And Tamar now is going to marry And God just lays out for us. And this is what I find amazing about the scriptures, guys, is that these are the heroes. These are the Israelites. These are the ones that are God's chosen people. And then you just look at them and you see all of their flaws. And the Bible doesn't mask them. The Bible doesn't hide them. But the Bible just lays them out there. Let me tell you what was going on with Judah. He takes a Canaanite woman, and then he gives his son to a Canaanite woman. And it's just now this progression of wickedness and evil and idolatry is now becoming part of the family line. And it tells us in the next verse, a very interesting verse, it says that verse 7, Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord killed him. It's pretty serious. We don't know what Er's trip was. We don't know what he was doing wrong, but it was so bad that God said, you know what, you got to take this guy out. Because he's the eldest and he's going to be the next in line. And so for some reason, God goes, okay, this guy's too wicked. We're going to have to eliminate him. And then we get to verse 8. And Judah said to Onan, go into your brother's wife and marry her and raise up an heir to your brother. Now, here's the deal. Er's eliminated Onan's next in line. He's the next heir. And so Onan's thinking, wait a second, if I go and give a son to Tamar, what's going to happen is that he's going to become the heir, and it's going to be through his lineage because I'm giving him to my brother who was older. And so he comes up with a little plan. Look at going back there, look at verse 9. But Onan knew that the heir would not be his, and it came to pass when he went into his brother's wife that he omitted on the ground lest he should give an heir to his brother. This is pretty crazy stuff. I mean, kind of go, wait a second, this is getting a little too graphic here. You read some of the Bible stories and you're going, man, am I watching a soap opera or what? Right? This is pretty wild because it says that Onan decides that he's going to have relations with her, but instead of impregnating her, he emits on the ground. Now, some have tried to use this text to say God, doesn't approve of birth control, and therefore, because of what Onan did, God's going to kill him too, and we'll see that in a second. He's going to die as a result of his actions. Guys, this isn't about birth control here. This is about doing what was right and being deceptive. Because what his responsibility was to give his brother an heir. And he puts it off as though he's going to do it for his own pleasure, but then in reality he doesn't come through with his end of the bargain. So here Tamar gives herself to him, but yet he doesn't do what he was supposed to do. And God didn't take favor to that. So when it comes to birth control, you know what? That's between you and the Lord, right? I mean, I don't think the Bible has any clear, he says, go be fruitful and multiply. God bless you. Be fruitful and multiply, right? But the Bible doesn't say, you can't use birth control. You can't do any of this stuff. The Bible's very silent on the issue. And I think when the Bible's silent, we need to be silent on the issue. But one of the things you do see is that God was not pleased with Onan's decision here, because he took advantage of Tamar's willingness to conceive a child through him because of her husband. And then notice what happens. It says this, and Onan knew that the heir would not be his. It came in to pass that he went into his brother's wife, and he omitted on the ground lest he should give an heir to his brother. and the thing which he did displeased the Lord. Therefore, he killed him also. Now you got 2 dead sons. And not only but Onan, both of them killed by the Lord. That's pretty heavy. And the next in line, they have one more son, Sheila. Now Sheila was a male name at that time, and so just so you're aware, if your name's Sheila, don't be offended. It's not that was a different culture. Look at verse 11. And Judah said to Tamar, his brother-in-law, remain a widow in your father's house till my son Sheila is grown, for he said, lest he also die like his brother. And Tamar went and dwelt in her father's house. Now in the process of time, the daughter of Shua, Judah's wife, died, and Judah was comforted, and he went up to his sheep shearers at Timnah, he and his friends, Hira the Adullamite, and it was told Tamar, saying, look, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep. So she took off her widow garments, covered herself with a veil, wrapped herself, and sat at an open place, which was on the way to Timnah, for she saw, check this out, that Sheila was grown, and she was not given to him as a wife. What's happening? Judah's being deceptive. Judah's going, hey, man, I've lost 2 boys. Maybe it's Tamar. Maybe she's the one that's messed up. So I'm not going to sacrifice Sheila too. My other son. And so here's he's already grown up. He doesn't give her to Tamar to conceive a child for her. And now what's happening is Tamar is going, man, I've been duped. I've been duped by Judah. And she is now going to come up with her own scheme. And she takes off her mourning gear, all of her clothing that was for mourning because her husband had died, and she puts on different garments, and will be the garments of a prostitute. She put a veil over her face. And notice what happens. And Judah saw her. He thought she was a harlot because she had covered her face. And he turned to her by the way, and he said, please let me come into you, for he did not know that it was his daughter-in-law. So she said, what will you give me that you may come into me? And he said, I will send you a young goat from the flock. She said, well, will you give me a pledge till you send it? And he said, well, what pledge shall I give you? She said, your signet and your cord and your staff that is in your hand. And he gave them to her, and he went into her, and she conceived by him. Guys, this is scandalous. You got Judah who's buying prostitutes, and you got Tamar who's playing the prostitute. And you're going, you got to be kidding me. This is the children of Israel. And what's fascinating about the whole picture is that Judah was being deceptive to Tamar, and now Tamar is being deceptive to Judah, and she goes in and she's acting like she's one of the Canaanite prostitutes. And one of the customs in Canaan was that if you were, wanted to prosper and they were shearing their sheep, what you would do is you would sleep with one of the temple prostitutes, and was part of their worship. So this wasn't just prostitution, this was idolatry on top of it. And Judah is buying into all of this stuff, and he's compromising his own life. And you stand back and you just like, hey, I want to have sex with you. What are you going to give me? You can have a goat. They're making a deal. He goes, well, your goat's not here. What are you going to give me till your goat comes? Well, I'll give you my signet ring. A signet ring was what they would use to seal something that belonged to you. It was very unique. Only one person would have that signet ring, and it was kind of like your brand. If you wanted to, you would get clay. You would put your brand in the clay, your little signet in the clay, and then the clay would harden, and it would signify that was yours. And so she says, all I want is your signet ring, I want your staff, and I want your cord. And he has relations with her. And she conceives a child. This is scandalous. Look, watch this. So she arose and went away and laid aside her veil, put on the garment of her widowhood, and Judah sent the young goat by the hand of the friend of the Adulamite to receive his pledge from the woman's hand, and he did not find her. And he asked the men of that place, saying, where is the harlot who was openly by the roadside? And he said, there is no harlot in this place. And he returned to Judah and said, I cannot find her. Also, the men of the place said, there was no harlot in this place. And Judah said, let her take them for herself, lest we be ashamed. For I sent this young goat, and you have not found her. And it came to pass, about 3 months after. Now what's happening 3 months later? Tamar's starting to show. She's got a little bump. And everyone in town is talking. Isn't that the widow? She's pregnant. Someone go tell Judah. And Judah is going to hear about it. And watch what Judah says. They told Judah, and Tamar, your daughter-in-law, has played the harlot. Furthermore, she is with child by harlotry. So Judah said, bring her out and let her be burned. Ooh. Is that a little harsh? We'll make a public display of her. We'll just start her on fire right here in the middle of the square. Now, this is what's crazy, guys, is that Judah was just as guilty as Tamar was. She was the prostitute, but he was paying for her. He was just as guilty as she was, and yet he's casting this harsh judgment upon her, and yet he won't look in a mirror about his own life. You know, our sin always looks worse on somebody else, doesn't it? It's real easy for us to become pharisaical, like, I can't believe someone would do that. When in reality, you're doing the very same thing. And that's exactly what Judah does, man. He goes and he pronounces judgment before he even hears the story. And let's just, public burning, that would be a good idea. Verse 25. When she was brought out, she went to her father-in-law, saying, by the man of whom these belong, I'm with child. And she said, please determine whose they are, the signet, the cord, and the staff. Woo-hoo. Is that cold or what? She goes, I'll tell you who got me pregnant. Who does this ring belong to? The guy can just hear one gulp. What about this staff? Here's the cord. And Judah is convicted. He has to acknowledge, look, that's mine. Because everyone in the town knew it was his. There was no getting around it. And then he says this. So Judah acknowledged them and said, she has been more righteous than I, because I did not give her to Shelah my son, and he never knew her again. He goes, look, you're right, I'm wrong. I was supposed to give you an heir, and I held back my son from giving you an heir. And now I'm the guilty party. And God is going to take this man, Judah, and he's going to bring through Judah's line the Messiah. Guys, this is the grace of God. That God doesn't look upon man's failures or God's faults. God looks upon man's heart, and his heart to be open to turn from his life and acknowledge his wrong. That's what God looks at. And I don't care what you've ever done in your life, man. Let me tell you, you've never done something so bad that God can't forgive you. You've never done something so bad that God wouldn't look upon you with mercy and grace. God is going to, through this lineage, bring forth the Savior. And that's why when you read the lineage in Matthew chapter 1, I could turn there real quick, just so you get a grasp for this, man. how every Jew would have felt as they read this chapter. Because they knew these stories. They were aware of what was going on in the time of the Old Testament, because it had been documented. The books of Moses would have been already, given to the children of Israel when Matthew wrote this. This is the book of genealogies of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham begot Isaac, and Isaac begot Jacob, and Jacob begot Judah and his brothers, and Judah begot Perez and Zerah by Tamar. By Tamar. And Tamar is going to be in the genealogies of Jesus, along with Rahab, who was another prostitute. Incredible. Incredible. The grace of God. Because here's what God wants them to understand, and I think that's what He wants us to understand. It's not by anything you did, but it's by what He did. His grace is what saves us, not our works or our goodness. It's His grace. And his grace that now Tamar becomes more righteous than Judah. A Canaanite woman now carries on the lineage for the children of Israel as Tamar conceives. And it tells us in the next verse that Perez and the other brother come out, Zerah, and they become now the line that Jesus would come through. And then through that lineage also comes Rahab. Unbelievable, because this would have been Joseph's side of the family. Joseph, the father of Jesus. And as you read this whole thing, guys, it just stands out. Now, you're reading through that and you're going, man, Joseph has to be the line. Joseph, the one that doesn't show sin. No, it's Judah. It's Judah. Because God wanted His grace to be demonstrated. That God forgives sinners. Can you imagine, being the children of Israel? Because here's what happens. God chooses the children of Israel. They multiply. And then after some time, they get the law. And then they begin to live their life according to the law. Both, kind of vacillating back and forth. But at some point, by the time we come to Jesus, the Jews felt that they were the chosen people because they had the law. And they started thinking, hey, we're the good ones. That's why God picked us, because we're so good. I remember coming to the Lord, 27 years ago, man, going on 27, 28 years now. Man, time flies. And I remember thinking, why would God forgive me? Why would God choose me? I'm so messed up. I've done so many horrible things. Why would God even consider me? And as you grow in the Lord and you walk with the Lord, and some of those things that you used to wrestle with, some of the vices you used to have, start to get further and further away, and you've been walking with the Lord for 30 years now, and then all of a sudden you're going, man, I'm pretty good. No wonder God picked me. Right? It's real easy for us to start to think that it's about us. It's not about us. It's about Him and His grace. If it was up to you, you would have continued down that road of destruction. But God intervened. But God showed forth His mercy. God showed forth His grace. And He began this transformation in your life so that you become more and more like Him. And that's His goal. Not because of you, but because of Him. God reminds the children of Israel in Ezekiel chapter 36. Now what's happening in Ezekiel chapter 36, 37, chapter 38, and chapter 39 is all talking about God restoring the nation of Israel after much destruction, after much rebellion. And God has to remind them again in chapter 36, verse 22. He says, therefore, say to the house of Israel. That's the 12 tribes. Thus says the Lord God, I do not do this for your sake, O house of Israel, but for my holy name's sake, which you have profaned among the nations wherever you went. And I will sanctify my great name, which has been profaned among the nations, which you have profaned in their midst. And the nations shall know that I am the Lord, says the Lord God, when I am hallowed in you before their eyes. God had to remind them, look, it's not because of you. If it was up to you guys, all you did was profane my name everywhere you went. But I'm still going to show grace and mercy, and I'm still going to restore you because my name's at stake. It's his name. Guys, and he has rescued you and me because of his great name. And he's willing to forgive anyone who's willing to acknowledge their wrong, their sin, their failure, their need. God is willing to forgive anyone who's saying, God, I'm a sinner and I need to be saved. And I need my life to be transformed. And I need your Spirit to live inside of me so that I can even begin to live a life that's pleasing to you. I can't even do that on my own. I need God's grace. That's why when you read the book of Romans, and we'll close right here. Romans chapter 8, and here's where we wrap it up. Romans chapter 8. We'll pick up in Genesis 39. But Romans chapter 5, verse 8 is where I'm looking for. Romans chapter 5. Verse 6, I'm sorry. Watch what Romans 5:6 says. And when you were still without strength, in due time Christ died for the ungodly. For scarcely for a righteous man would one die. Perhaps for a good man someone would even dare to die. But God demonstrated his own love toward us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Much more than having been justified by his blood, we shall be saved from wrath through him. Isn't that awesome? Because even when you were a sinner, Christ died for you. So that the wrath of God wouldn't have to be poured out upon you. But God's mercy and God's grace now poured out upon you. I think when you read these two chapters side by side, it's just one of those where you just realize, man, God takes messed up people and he can change them and transform them, and then he can accomplish his purposes in them. And then all that God's looking for is for that messed up person to acknowledge that they're messed up. That's it. That's what it says. It says if you confess your sins, 1 John 1, 8 and 9, if you confess your sins, God's faithful and just to forgive us for all unrighteousness. He's looking for just confess. God, I'm a sinner. I need to be saved. Come into my life. And the moment you do that, man, God, by his grace, begins that work. Not because of you, because of him.